Welcome back. We are continuing our conversation with Gordon G. Chang, and I encourage you to follow him as I do on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang, as well as his abundant output in so many places Epic Times, Newsweek, uh, Gatestone Institute, just to name a few, the national interest. Um, Gordon is one of our regulars here, and we prize our visits with him. And in particular, Gordon, I wanted to commend you for a very thoughtful, very important piece that you had Gatestone, I think, last week now, in which you talked about what Taiwan can do to deter what the Chinese Communist Party is making no bones about is now in decided prospect, namely an invasion by Beijing of the island of Taiwan. Talk a bit about what kinds of capabilities the Taiwanese, quite apart from whatever we should be providing them, have and might usefully bring to bear to deter an invasion of Taiwan by China.
The most important weapon that Taiwan has is a supersonic cruise missile, the Yunfeng, which has a range of 1,240 miles, which means it can reach Beijing and it could also reach the Three Gorges Dam. Three Gorges Dam sits upstream on the Yangtze River from 400 million Chinese people. So that's about 30% of the country's population. And that essentially gives Taiwan, although it doesn't have nuclear weapons at the moment, it gives them a weapon which has the effect of a nuclear weapon. Matter of fact, more than a nuke. So this is an important deterrent. The only issue here, though, is does Taiwan have enough of these missiles? Because clearly China has a lot of targets. They have assembled an invasion force, which is enormous.
Mhm.
And it's not just the Chinese military, it's also all the Boeing and Airbus aircraft, also the
Mhm.
civilian barges on the Yangtze River. There are an enormous number of invasion vehicles. So Taiwan needs a far bigger arsenal of cruise missiles than it currently has.
But just so I'm clear, you're saying that the Taiwanese capability to destroy the Three Gorges Dam, which would put at risk, I think your number was 400 million people downstream, and untold other repercussions, obviously, as well, economic among them, is something that the Chinese would have to take into account, even at this point, let alone if there are more of these missiles brought to bear.
Yes, China certainly has to take that into account because Taiwan can do indescribable damage. Now, the one thing that is a real concern is that Taiwan's had this capability for some time, but it's only been recently that they've been talking about it, which
Mhm.
means that in public, which means that Taiwan fears an invasion, I think, in the short term. Otherwise, they wouldn't discuss their capability of killing hundreds of millions of Chinese. That's not something
Yeah,
which is politically popular in many parts of the world, including in Washington, by the way. But it shows the
right.
urgency in the minds of people in Taiwan about the defense of their island.
Well, and it seems to me they are entitled to feel that urgency. It does, as we've been discussing, Gordon, now seem as though this is not simply an abstract threat from China. It is a very direct, very material one, and possibly a very imminent one as well. Um, Gordon, we're having this conversation as Western leaders in the G7 in recent days, in the NATO summit and coming one. We'll be talking increasingly, it seems, about China and what it's up to. There are several European allies, of course, in the NATO summit, but now also allies from Western Pacific nations that are coming together for this NATO summit in Spain. And I wanted to ask you about one of the initiatives that is sort of now part of the agenda of these meetings, and that is trying to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. And maybe just give us a quick sense of the state of play with respect to that, well, I call it empire infrastructure building operation, and what this so-called uh, PGII, a plan for a global infrastructure and investment alternative, amounts to.
China's Belt and Road now since 2013 has built a lot of infrastructure around the world. And in some places that has given China influence. In other places, it's become a weight around the neck of Beijing. So, for instance, in Sri Lanka, as well as in Pakistan, they've become real problems for Beijing. So, Belt and Road has a mixed record for China, but there are certain things that are really
When you say
worrisome.
the real problems, you're referring to the debt that is now burdening these countries, I take it?
The real debt. So, for instance, in Sri Lanka, they have a crisis right now, and it appears that China has
Hmm.
lost a lot of influence, even though it's poured a lot of money into China, into Sri Lanka. Um, this is a real cautionary tale for Beijing, as well as Pakistan, where they're putting in good money after bad. But there are certain things about Belt and Road that are extremely worrying. So, for instance, China's building a container port in Freeport in the Bahamas. $3.4
Hmm.
billion looks to be much too big to be economically justifiable, which means that China will, like it's done in Sri Lanka and in other places, repossess the infrastructure, which means it could
Hmm.
be end up a Chinese naval base. And that's
Right.
87 miles east of Palm Beach. So that
Hmm.
is a warning for us. But by and large, China has, I think, poured a lot of money into countries with relatively little effect. What Biden is doing with his global infrastructure plan is $200 billion of US commitment, $400 billion from others. It's into a series of mixed things. Some of it is physical infrastructure, some of it is gender equality, climate change. Part of it is digital. The digital part is the most important because I think that if we're going to spend $600 billion, we should spend it in competing against Huawei technologies, the
Hmm.
China 5G provider, because Beijing has been able to wire the world, much of the world, with Huawei equipment. That gives it the capability of grabbing information and stealing it. And so this is where I think we should be putting our money, not into bridges and roads, because there China's record is really quite mixed.
Well, of course, they have pursued it with a view, it seems to me, Gordon, of the expropriation of those assets. Certainly, we've seen a number of ports being essentially taken over by the Chinese, and those rail networks and road networks and other infrastructure can certainly be used by the Chinese to varying degrees for power projection, and that's my longer term concern. But with respect to this, the alternative that the West is now advancing, it does seem to me it's more sensible by far for us to be focusing on the sorts of things that these countries perceive they need than some of the pet rocks of the West, whether they're equity and inclusion and the like, whatever that means in this context, or for that matter, climate change related. These are things that you need to actually be tangible about, it seems to me, if you're going to be competing with the Chinese on all of these fronts. Gordon, we have to leave it at that. There's so much more to talk with you about. I am so grateful to you for your various contributions, both to this program, of course, and elsewhere, and commend once again to all of our listeners following you at Gordon G. Chang as a tremendous daily feed on developments with respect to China, the Western Pacific, and indeed our world. Gordon Chang, you are one great American. We're always delighted to have you with us. I hope that you will come back to us next week with more insights and analysis and perhaps even a bit better news. We can always hope for that. Thank you, sir. God bless you. Next up, Ben Borquim of Real America's Voice joins us to talk about border terrorism and more right after this.